Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Matthew Dix. Matthew is the author of Someday is Today and 9 other books, a best-selling novelist, nationally recognized storyteller, an award-winning elementary school teacher. He teaches storytelling and communications at universities, corporate workplaces, and community organizations. Dix has won multiple Moth GrandSLAM story competitions and, together with his wife, created the organization Speak Up to help others share their stories. And they also co-host the Speak Up Storytelling podcast. He lives in Connecticut with his family. Matthew, it's great to have you here on the Voice of Influence podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So with everything else you have going on, you are also a teacher.
I am for
Can you tell us about that?
4 years. It's well, I've been teaching for 24 years. It's a wonderful job. It's sort of one of the many things I always wanted to do when I was a kid. I teach 5th graders, 10-year-olds, and it's the job that my sort of financial people say you probably should not be doing that anymore. You're losing money every time you go to school. And my wife is a kindergarten teacher. And even she says you might want to consider hanging up that hat at some point. But I love the kids a lot. And if you do something for as long as I have, and you sort of approach it in the way I approach it, it's not overtaxing. It's an enjoyable thing that I do. My school is 5 minutes from my home. It's a wonderful place to be. And I don't know, I've been in the same classroom for 20 years. It's going to be hard for them to sort of get rid of me until I want to leave. So I enjoy it. I really love doing it most days. And so I continue.
I was a music teacher, and 4th and 5th graders, they're just fantastic, aren't they? They're just like in that really sweet spot of still needing and caring and also ready to really learn and grow and that sort of thing. So you said your approach to teaching. Tell me a little bit more about that approach. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think a lot of teachers become teachers because they loved school and they liked being good students. And so most of my colleagues tend to be rule followers and people pleasers. And, they sort of believe that every single thing has to be done at 100%. And I am a person who, my wife and I, we talk about how she's the mouse in the relationship. It's part of the Native American spirit wheel. I talk about it in the book. My wife is a mouse, which means she is focused on the details, which is wonderful when you want to decorate your living room. Because if I tried to decorate our living room, it would be a disaster. Instead, it looks beautiful. And my wife can walk through a museum and tell you who painted what and, all of the stylistic elements of a painting. She's really great at all of those things. But when it comes to something like writing a report card, my colleagues can take, dozens of hours writing report cards, and sort of the eagle version of life, which tends to be me more, which is I see the big picture. I fly over things and see what's important and what's not. I say to myself, well, parents really just want to know that I love their kid, that I understand their kid, and that I'm going to push their kid to achieve more. And everything else is kind of irrelevant. So what takes me an hour takes my wife 20 hours. And that's sort of how most of my teaching career is, which is I understand the things that really matter and I focus on those things and I let go of the details, like a bulletin board, for example. I watch my colleagues spend hours perfecting a bulletin board, and the only person who actually cares about the bulletin board is them, which is a weird thing, that they're doing all this work for themselves because the kids don't care, right? So the job gets a little easier when you're willing to pull back on the things that don't matter. And if you're willing to sort of break a rule every now and again and then apologize if it turns out not to be so good, teaching gets a little easier. I always say there's a reason why classrooms have doors. You can say yes to your boss. Yes, I'll take care of that. No problem. And then you close the door and you do what you know is right. And as long as the kids are learning and they are happy and their parents are happy, you're going to be fine.
And yeah, kids learning, and then just kids accepting, like knowing that you care about them is such a huge piece of their development, period.
Yeah, it's the most important thing, I think, especially as my career has moved on, I have come to understand that content is not terribly relevant. It is not important that my students understand the economic structures of Maryland's pre-colonial colony, right? That is not a critical piece of information that they're going to need. And if they do need it, they have access to it today in ways that we can't imagine. It's much more important that they understand, here's how you work with a person. Here's how you work hard. Here's how to feel good about yourself. Here's what to do when you're not feeling good about yourself. Here's how to make something fun that wasn't fun a minute ago. If I teach my students those lessons and they don't learn, the difference between there and there and there as well as they could have, that's going to be okay. That's not going to cause them problems. That those skills can be picked up later, but the skills of, I know how to live with people and work with people and feel good about myself. That's the most important thing I work with kids on every day.
Hmm. How has your experience as a teacher then informed or even led to, I'm not totally clear on your whole story about how you got started speaking and writing and all of that too. I'm assuming that your experience in education has had an impact on that. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I always wanted to be a writer. And so I started writing right out of college. I did a bad job of it for a long time. And then eventually I figured out how to do it. So in terms of writing, the writing has influenced the way I teach writing more than anything really. But in terms of being a public speaker, it was never a goal of mine. I went to New York City in 2011 to tell a story for the Moth, which is a international storytelling organization. It was a competition, actually. It was an open mic, drop your name in a hat. Hopefully they pick it out and you tell a story. I didn't even want to go. My friends sort of dared me to go. They said, you've lived the worst life of anyone we know. You should go tell those stories, which is not a nice thing to say to your friend. And I really didn't want to do it. I figured I'd do it once. I'd never do it again. I took the stage when my name was pulled. I actually tried not to take the stage. I sat quietly hoping they would move on to someone else, but my wife was there. She kicked me under the table and said, get on the stage. And so I got up to tell what I thought would be the only story I'd ever tell on a stage. And as soon as I began speaking, I fell in love with it. The moment I spoke a word in the microphone, I knew I had found something that I enjoyed. And I won that competition. And I've gone on to win many, many more. And there was a point in my life when I was talking to a class one day, adults, about storytelling. And I said, I just got lucky that I had stumbled into something later in life that I was naturally good at. And my wife was in the back of the room and she said, is that what you really think? Do you think you were naturally good at standing in front of 1,000 people and speaking? And I said, well, I mean, how else do you explain it? And she said, well, you've been writing stories ever since you were 17. So obviously you understand story in a way that most people might not. I've been a wedding DJ for the last 25 years. So I've been standing in front of audiences and speaking extemporaneously. So there was no fear in me. And then she said, and you're also an elementary school teacher. You basically stand in front of the worst audience there ever was, which is 10-year-old kids, and you seek to entertain them throughout the day so that they behave and learn. And so she explained to me in a way that I never understood that all of those things led to a moment on an evening in New York when I took a stage and found success. So, it seemed like I was sort of an overnight, wow, he suddenly was good and didn't have to earn his bones. But really, I had been doing it for a long time and just not aware of it.
It's amazing how our lives do have a thread that
Yeah.
kind of lead us.
Well,
there.
if you
Yeah.
have a wife who can point out that thread to you,
Yeah,
otherwise I
that's
would have been
helpful.
sitting. Yeah, I would have said, well, I was just naturally good at it. I don't know.
And then everybody else is left going, how in the world? But yeah, that's cool. Why do you care so much about helping other people tell their stories?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons. I think selfishly, I think the world is filled with terrible stories, and I would like to improve the quality for my own personal entertainment. But I also just think that I think a lot of people, when it comes to telling stories, a lot of people tell the wrong stories. And I think they tell the wrong stories because they don't understand what's happening in their life that is meaningful. I think most of us live lives where terribly important things happen to us and we don't notice them. because they don't involve a car chase or a dog biting us or, some fantastical thing taking place. I think most of the stories, most of them, the most interesting stories we have to tell are small stories where almost nothing happens and it all is taking place inside our heads. And because it's all taking place inside our heads, we sort of discount it as being relevant to share or even to think about. And so I think when I help people find and tell the right stories, and finding is really important, I think it helps them to live a more purposeful life. I think that most people don't live lives where they make bad decisions. I think most people live lives where they make no decisions. I think they are like water down a mountain, just sort of following the path of least resistance, the thing that people thought they should do, or the universe pushed them in a certain way, or a series of events just led them onto the path they happened to be on, rather than a path they really wanted to be on or still want to be on. So I think when we tell stories, we examine our lives in meaningful ways, and we can figure out where we're supposed to be going, rather than quite often the directions we are tragically going in.
I really, really resonate with that. I find that people can often get a sense of purpose, whether it's their one purpose or just a purpose, when they can identify something that had irritated them and they realized, oh my goodness, no, that was actually not just irritation, it was sadness. And what made that personal? Oh my goodness, it was this. And oh, and I care about this so much. That's why it irritated me so much. And then they're kind of led to this sense of purpose, like you're talking about. Yeah.
Most people don't take that step you just described, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that most people spend most of their time thinking about their spouse and partner and parents and children and bosses and colleagues and clients and neighbors and everyone else but themselves. And I think storytellers are self-centered in a really positive way, meaning we afford ourselves the opportunity to think about ourselves. And I just don't think most people do that. Like, I always encourage people, 10 minutes every day, you should just think about yourself. You should tell your spouse to go for a drive, lock your children in the basement, tell your roommates to get the hell out, and to just sit on the couch and ask yourself, well, who am I? How did I end up here? What direction am I headed? Why am I headed in that direction? A lot of people don't live with what I call a horizon, which is, what are you chasing now? And if you're not chasing something, you're probably just living day to day, which means I'm going to live this day, I'm going to go to sleep, and then I'm going to rinse and repeat tomorrow. And every day is going to kind of be essentially the same, rather than knowing that there's something out there that you can be chasing. You can have a point on a horizon. That point can change. You can alter your course depending on thoughts and feelings you're having. But if you don't have that point on the horizon, then I think you're probably trapped in some stasis. I think you're probably binging a lot of Netflix. I think you're probably, doing what you think is appropriate rather than what you really want. And so I think we have to think about ourselves in order to achieve that. That step you just described, I'm not irritated, I'm actually sad, is an enormous leap that most people don't take because they don't think about themselves.
Mm. When you're talking about all that, it very much sounds like identifying a story that you're a part of, that you're living. And if you don't identify that story, then you're stuck, or you're maybe treading water, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. And even understanding the story that came before is so important too.
Mm.
I think that through storytelling, one of the things I've managed to do is, I have had a very challenging life at times. And a lot of times I know that those challenges can sort of be like an anchor. They can really drag people down and hold them in a place that they don't want to be. But if we look back on our lives and we start to think of our lives through a narrative structure, through story, what we can do is we can take a really difficult time in our lives and turn it into a chapter. We can give it a beginning and an end. Because I think a lot of times, I was homeless for a period in my life. And the fact that I was homeless and that no one helped me for a long time was something that sort of infected everything I did. It became part of my everyday existence. And then one day I decided, I'm going to tell a story about the time I became homeless. And the moment I did, it became a beginning and an end. It's a chapter. The infection was sort of cut off from the rest of my life. I brought art and craft to it. So it had something worth saying. And then I began telling it to people. And when I started telling it to people, like everyone came to me and said, I was homeless for 9 months in my life. I slept in my car for 2 months. I haven't wanted to tell anyone about it. I tell that story every year to my students. And a couple of years ago, one of my students came to me and she told me that she had been living in her car with her mother over the summer. And they had managed to get into housing, but she was worried that if they lost the housing, she'd have to go back to the car. And she was worried she wouldn't be able to come to school anymore. And she wanted to know, if I have to live in my car, can I still come to school? And she wouldn't have told me that if I hadn't told that story to her, right? So taking those difficult times in our lives, and if we can bring some meaning and some hope and some help to other people, suddenly that homeless period in my life doesn't seem so bad after all. You know, it's a chapter and it was rotten, but it's managed to help some people and have some entertainment value, oddly, if you craft it well enough, all of those things. So I think seeing the chapters ahead, but also rationalizing and revisiting the chapters that came before is also just as important.
Right. Really good point. Yeah. There's so much redemption in that story that you just told, and how people can gain something out of what you have taken time to actually process and craft. And
Yeah.
that's very meaningful.
Well, those are the stories people want to hear too. I always tell storytellers, like, no one wants to hear your success.
Mm-hmm.
No one other than like maybe your mother wants to hear how wonderful you are. You know, when you get on a stage, or even when you're at the dining room table or at a dinner party, like the stories people really want to hear is, let me tell you how I screwed up. Let me tell you the stupid thing I did. Let me tell you the bad parenting decision I made. Because those are the stories that connect with people. Because we all sit here thinking we're the bad one, that, you know, no one else has done this dumb thing that I did. No one's ever been as bad as I have been. And as soon as someone says, oh no, let me tell you about the bad thing that I did, or the dumb thing, or the shameful thing, suddenly you don't feel so alone anymore. They're like, he understands me. He will understand, even if it's not exactly the same thing, like contextually, you know, on an emotional level and a meaning level. Suddenly you can connect with people in extraordinary ways. I always say I'm the bearer of more secrets than you could ever imagine. And it's merely because I stand on a stage and I tell my secrets, and suddenly everyone feels safe telling me theirs.
Mm-hmm. You know, that is such a notable thought for people who are leaders in organizations too, because it's often, I mean, I think for so long, the idea was we needed to appear strong and competent and have it together and confident in our direction. I think certainly there were people who were somewhat vulnerable and transparent before the pandemic hit, but certainly afterwards, it became more and more evident that that was so important. We're hearing so many stories of and just data around people needing to connect as a human being, and how much more respect they have for their leaders when they are transparent, like you're talking about as well.
Yeah, I think there's a misnomer that you can't talk about your failures and also be confident at the same time. And I think you can do both, right?
Absolutely.
You can be confident in the fact that you have not been perfect. You know, I worked with the CEO of a very large hospital. She had to give a talk to about 4,000 of her people, and she was going to tell a story. And the story we finally settled on, to her credit, was how her hospital botched her husband's knee surgery in a really terrible way. And it required 2 further surgeries and a lot more recovery than was necessary. And, you know, at first she said, I don't know if I really want to tell everyone how the hospital failed my husband. But to her credit, she came to understand very quickly, and really probably on her own more than any help I offered her, was that this is the story that will indicate to people that you understand them, because no one thinks a hospital is perfect. No one thinks that every surgery goes well. And she called me the next day after she told that story. And she said, from the time she parked her car in the parking garage to the time she made it to her office, people who had never spoken to her in her entire life, people who worked for her who she'd never really met before, came and thanked her for telling the story. And they told her things that were going on in the hospital that she had never heard before that she needed to know, because she was willing to stand up there and confidently say, we are not perfect, that the hospital that I run is not perfect. And so it's not weak to talk about your failure, your shame, your embarrassment, your struggle. There's nothing weak about it at all. It is the strongest and bravest thing you can do. And you can do it with enormous confidence. And when you're done speaking about it, you can still be the positive, self-assured leader that people want. They just know that you're actually a human being as well.
That's
and that you're
right.
not just this icon of perfection standing on the stage that everyone should seek to, be the same. Like, you're just a human being who's capable of leading in all the ways we want, but also has deep humanity as well.
Oh, I love the way you put that. I've had a relationship with the word vulnerability for a very long time. And the word vulnerability itself to me is admitting that you could get hurt by people thinking badly about you or whatever, like it's of course there are situations in which you might be a little bit vulnerable, but I don't think it requires vulnerability to be transparent. It's not, you don't, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, like, just because I say something that you might judge me for doesn't mean that I feel vulnerable in this moment, because maybe I'm
Right.
confident enough to know that it's okay if you realize that I'm human. Like, I guess
Yes.
that might be the best way to put it.
And I think that 99% of the people in the world don't judge someone who is being vulnerable or transparent. We think that,
Yes.
and oddly, when people come to me and they say, how do you share the things that you share, like in front of people, like I wish I could do that. Like, what they really are asking me is, could you give me the magic pill that will make me feel immune in the way you feel immune? And I tell them, like, there is no magic pill. What you have to do is you have to go do it, and then discover that people love you more for it.
Mm.
And then it will feel better. Now, I also acknowledge that I am a white, straight American man. So the universe has been bending for me all of my life. So it's much easier for me to say, stand on a stage and be vulnerable, speak your truth, express your fragility. I think if I was a member of a marginalized community, if I was a woman, a person of color, a member of the LGBTQ community, all of those things make it much harder, not impossible. I just think it requires a lot more courage, sadly, for folks who are not like me to do what I preach. I think it's still necessary, but I acknowledge the privilege I have and how it is easier for me than it is for a lot of other people.
Mm. I appreciate that. Yeah. Let's talk about your book. So, what's so bad about the word someday?
Someday is a trap. Someday is the idea that, well, that most people in the world have a dream and they think that someday they're going to chase it. And then the truth of life is that there's a finite number of some days. And I think what most people do is they envision a future where they will finally get that thing done they want to get done. And then instead they die. I think they run out of time and they die. And if you speak to hospice workers, they will tell you that in the final days of a person's life, the thing they talk most about is their regret, the regret over the opportunities not taken, the risks avoided, the dreams deferred, all of those things. And so I hate the word someday because I think it just helps people procrastinate on doing the thing they really want to do and the thing that will bring happiness to them. I think they somehow think that someday I'm going to do that thing that will make me happy, as if the state they're in now doesn't deserve to be happy as well, right? Like, someday I'll chase that dream and I'm really going to be happy. Well, how about just being happy today? Don't you deserve to be happy today? And so that's why I hate the word someday.
I really value what you just said. I mean, that's something that my husband and I talk about quite frequently, is like, what are we waiting for? They're not that we're particularly doing that in all areas of our lives, but every once in a while, when we're feeling really busy and bogged down or overwhelmed, and then kind of taking a step back and saying, why are we acting like this is the way it has to be? Why are we
Right.
waiting and putting off what we want now? And so I think that's kind of been exacerbated by just losing both of our moms at really early ages. And kind of realizing that no, if we're gonna, whatever we're gonna do, we need to do it.
Yeah, when I was 21, I was robbed at gunpoint,
Wow.
and a gun was put to my head, and they counted back from 3 and told me, when they got to 1, they were going to pull the trigger, and they counted. And, it was and that was the tip of the iceberg of things they did to me that day. And, as they were counting back, I was absolutely certain that I was in the final moments of my life. And the astounding thing about that moment for me was that I wasn't afraid or sad or angry. The only feeling I had was regret over the fact that I was 21 and I had basically done nothing with my life at this point. And all the dreams I hadn't even begun to chase. And, I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, including the younger version of me. But in a lot of ways, it was also a gift, because it was the moment when I committed myself to the idea that I am not going to live ever again with the threat of having regret sometime in my future. And that doesn't mean become a workaholic and chase every professional ambition you have. My wife wrote the foreword to my book because in that foreword, she says, he's crazy in a lot of ways. The fact that he times his dishwasher emptying process so that it can be the quickest possible is ridiculous. And the fact that when he takes a shower, he counts to 100 and tries to get out of the shower in less than 100 seconds is just stupid. There's like a lot of ridiculousness that he does, but she points out it's all led to the fact that he is able to do all of these things that most people can't do, and also spend lots of time with the family, and play golf with his friends, and play poker, and pet his cats, and pursue his hobbies, and do all of the other things. That foreword was written so people didn't think you have to be a crazy workaholic to achieve all of your goals. When I talk about living without regret, that means living without the regret of not having spent time with friends, and not having traveled, and not having spent every possible moment with my children that they are willing to put up with me. All of those things are included with the writing and the teaching and the speaking and the building of businesses, all of those things together. So I've just really, since that moment on that greasy tile floor in that McDonald's restaurant with that gun, since that moment, I've sort of just relentlessly pursued happiness and fulfillment.
Hmm. So I was going to say at the beginning, when you first started talking about it, it sounded like a lot of pressure, but then it sounds now, after hearing what you just said, it sounds more like a pursuit of efficiency for the sake of being able to do what you want and making
Yeah.
intentional decisions.
Yeah, that's really it. We have to do things in our lives to continue to eat and have a roof over our heads and, have a warm house. All of those things are required, unfortunately. And, part of my book talks about the idea that we just have to find ways to do those things as efficiently as possible so we can get to the things that we truly enjoy. So if I can shave 2 minutes off the emptying of a dishwasher, and I have to do that every day, it doesn't take a lot of math to figure out how much time I'm going to begin saving compared to someone who does the dishwasher emptying thing willy-nilly, or if I am able to take a shower in 100 seconds and it takes one of my clients 20 minutes, I tell my client, you're never going to beat me because I have like 18 more minutes a day than you don't have, which means my day is essentially 24 hours and 18 minutes and yours is 24 hours. And therefore it'll be really hard for you to catch up to me. And if you pile up enough of those small decisions, and it doesn't have to be those two, but if you pile up enough of those, why am I doing it this way when I can do it more efficiently? Pile up enough, suddenly you'll find I have plenty of time to play catch with my kid. I have plenty of time to write that book. I have plenty of time to work on my business. I think people just dither away their time. I think they find themselves, my wife calls this time black holes. She says, I fill all the black holes of my life. And so she acknowledges it. When I say it's time to go, everybody, that means my son has to find his shoes. They're always in 2 different rooms. It's going to take 5 minutes. My daughter has to grab 4 books because if we have to drive 10 minutes, she definitely needs 4 books to read, even though each book is 700 pages long. And my wife has to make sure she has her sunglasses and did she put on sunscreen. So I could be standing at the door, which is what my wife often does, for 7 minutes, and she's scrolling through some social media that is making her feel bad about herself because that's what it's designed to do. And instead, I am writing 6 good sentences in my next book, or I am folding half a load of laundry so that when I get back at home, I only have to fold the other half. People have this weird, like, if I can't do all of it, I'm not going to do any of it. Or they have this weird belief that they can only do things in 30-minute increments. Like, I can only write if I have an hour. And I think, well, aren't you fortunate? Because during World War II, there were soldiers in trenches wearing gas masks with artillery blowing up over their heads, scribbling in notebooks, hoping that someday it might become a book they can publish, and people today tell me I can only write in an hour increment, and I really need to be at Starbucks, and I have to have a latte and smooth jazz. And I think, well, aren't you fortunate that the world seems to have existed just for you? That's where people live, though. And so we have plenty of time, but we tend to dither it away meaninglessly by not making active decisions. So part of my book is about that, the efficiency of time.
All right. So a lot of our listeners are CEOs, founders. There might be a busy executive who's pretty consumed with their company. Maybe there are creative aspects to their work, but they miss maybe the artsy, creative parts of themselves. And then, of course, there's plenty of stress coming off of COVID and now inflation, the threat of murmurs and threat of recession. These folks are busy and they have a lot on their minds all the time. Why does it matter that these folks have some sort of creative self-expression?
Well, first, I just think no matter what you're doing, whether you're a CEO or you're taking care of my cat, I just think that as a human being, we all had something when we were a kid that is still within us, whether it was wanting to paint a picture or tell a story or, grow a garden, whatever it is. And I think we have to keep nurturing that thing. But I think more importantly, when I work with folks sort of in the corporate world, one of the things I try to make them understand is that you can choose to be sort of round, white, and tasteless, which is what I'm convinced most people in the corporate world want to be. And that means you're forgettable. And a lot of times I think that's what they want, because to be memorable is dangerous and scary. To sort of say things that other people in their industry are not saying, or saying it in ways that other people are not saying, it can be really scary. So it makes sense to want to fit in. But when you seek to fit in, you become forgettable. How many times have you gone to a conference, listened to someone speak, you leave the conference, you stop in the restroom on the way out, and by the time you're getting into your car, you could never really say what that person who you just heard speaking actually said, right? Because most of the time, what people say in these environments is round, white, and tasteless. I think that when you pursue your creativity, when you seek to be a more creative person, when you seek to hold on to that gardener or that writer or that artist in you, it allows you to differentiate yourself from other people if you're daring enough to do it. So that when I work with an executive and we talk about becoming a more memorable person, someone noticeable in the room, and I start to talk about the things that you should be talking about that might mean something to other people, if you actually are pursuing a creative life, a life outside of this, this industrial complex that you occupy on a daily basis, made up mostly of sort of spreadsheets and PowerPoint, displays and things like that. When you seek that, it becomes so much more easier to be an interesting person. And when you're standing on a stage or I'm helping you craft a keynote, boy, is it easy for me to help someone do that in a way where they're going to be meaningful and impactful if they actually have things to say. If you're not creative, the only thing you have to say is the stuff that everybody else is saying. And that's not really a wonderful path to be on. I just think we want to differentiate ourselves. And the way we do it is by pursuing our creative sides so we can bring those aspects of ourselves into everything that we do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I also loved the example that you already gave of the CEO of the hospital that told the story that made her human. I mean, to feel connected like that to somebody who's leading your organization, and that's a powerful thing right now, especially anytime, but especially right now.
Yeah. When I work with companies, one of the things I do is a lot of marketing with them, because storytelling and marketing tend to go along together. And I'm always astounded by the idea that we're going to build a marketing deck that anyone could deliver. That regardless of who's going to actually do the speaking, it doesn't matter, because the marketing deck is going to work no matter what. And I think, well, that sounds terrible, because that means the person who's speaking is now utterly irrelevant in every way whatsoever. What we should be doing is sort of building our marketing decks to match the person who's actually speaking. I remember early on, I was working with an executive, and we were trying to come up with a metaphor to sort of explain a new product they were putting out. And this executive is a paddleboarder, and I happen to know it because, we've gotten friendly. And she was talking about how, like, old business was this factory that she paddleboards by all the time. And new business is sort of the other side of the river. And she noticed the difference between the two. And she said, that might make a good metaphor. I said, it's a great metaphor. And can we put you on the paddleboard too, in the middle of the deck? And she said, well, why am I going to be on the paddleboard? I said, because you paddleboard. And now you're going to be the person who paddleboards, as opposed to the amorphous blob of a human being who has no personality, who wants to talk about old business and new business, but doesn't actually have anything interesting other than that. And so when I can convince people to sort of put yourself into the work you're doing, allow us to a peek into who you are as a person. Like, if you have kids, mention it, because people with kids like people who have kids, because we all understand how awful they can be at times. When we're able to do those things, when we can find ways to infuse a little bit of ourselves into everything that we do, then we're memorable, and then we're impactful, and then we connect with other people, right? When she says, I paddleboard and I notice this thing in the river, and then she steps off stage, every paddleboarder in the room will now come to her and talk to her about paddleboarding. And that will be a connection that she will make to people. And every kayaker will come up to her and say, I kayak, is that like paddleboarding? Right? And every person who wants to paddleboard will come up to her and say, should I get an inflatable paddleboard, or should I get one of the fiberglass ones? Which, by the way, she told me to get the inflatable one, and I was riding it yesterday on the lake because of her. So if we can do that, we can just be so much more effective than what tends to happen in this world today, which is everyone is forgettable because everyone is afraid to be memorable.
You just shared a bunch of little ideas, but are there any other key aspects to storytelling that you think every leader should know?
Well, I think they have to have stories to tell. I think that we spend most of our lives thinking about everyone but ourselves. And so we tend not to have very many interesting stories to tell. The wrong stories get told all the time in the world today. People tell stories about stuff that happened to them because it seems interesting, but it doesn't actually share anything about their heart or their mind. It's just a weird thing that happened, which is utterly forgettable, which is essentially every sitcom you've ever seen, which seems lovely in the moment that you're watching it. But try to think of the plot of a sitcom from 10 years ago, and it's lost to you. You really can't remember it because it was just stuff that happened to people in a weird way. So, if you're running a company or you're leading people, I think you should be able to say interesting and connective things to people. And so you should be looking for stories to tell. I think you have to become a more introspective person. I always encourage people to spend time thinking about just themselves, right? And, I have a process in one of my books I talk about called Homework for Life, which is the idea that at the end of every day, regardless of the day you have just led, even if it was spent all day in bed because you had the flu, what's the one moment from your day that made it different than all the other moments in that day? And then I write it down, not as a story, but I write it down in a spreadsheet, something short, something simple, something easily repeatable. And, through this process of Homework for Life, which thousands of people all over the world do now, I've discovered that our lives are filled with interesting and meaningful things to say. All of us have it. I am not a unicorn in any way. The problem is we just leave all those moments behind. We act as if our memories are worthless and we just walk past them. And then suddenly, like, we can play a terrible game here. Take your age, whatever it happens to be, subtract 12, right? So I'm 50, subtract 12, 38. How many stories can you tell me about that year of your life, right? Unless you had a kid or you got divorced or you had a big move, a lot of people can go all the way around the sun for 1 year and have nothing to say about it 12 years later. They've completely forgotten a year of their life. It's not because the life that life wasn't lived well during that year. It doesn't mean the year was useless. It just means they discarded everything that happened as meaningless. I don't think it's meaningless for a million reasons. I think it makes you feel better about your life by holding on to things. I think it gives you more to say. I think as a leader, it gives you the opportunity to connect with people in much more powerful and frequent ways. I'm often called on by companies to offer metaphors all the time. There's a company that calls me the metaphor guy. The only reason I have metaphors is because I have a million stories to lean on. And the only reason I have a million stories to lean on is because I do homework for life. I'm interested in myself. I'm curious in myself. I afford myself time to think about myself, not to the exclusion of other people, but 10 minutes a day. I just say, who am I? Where am I? Why am I? What did I think today? What happened today that made this day different than other days? And then suddenly I have stuff to say. And so when I'm in a meeting with someone, one of the policies I always have, this is a good leadership policy, is be the last person to speak in every room that you enter, particularly if you're a white man. It served me really well. I went to an all women's college for my teaching degree. I spent every single day in a room with nothing but women. So I learned very quickly, shut up. They do not want to hear from you. They went to an all women's college for a reason, and it was not because you were going to be here. So it's a really useful skill in that if you choose to be the last person to speak, you get to take the landscape of everybody. You get to listen to everyone so that when it's your turn to speak, when you're taking an opportunity to speak, you can say something that is impactful and meaningful and connective, as opposed to just saying the first thing that comes to your mind. And if you have a wealth of stories like I do, I always can find a story that will somehow match with something someone has said in a strategic way to make a connection. So it also opens up space for marginalized people who often don't feel like they have an opportunity to speak in a way that I know I have always felt I've had that opportunity. But that's the value of having stories. All of those things, being able to just be a memorable, impactful, connective human being by telling stories and finding those stories to tell.
So one of the things that we focus on here with Voice of Influence is having healthy influence versus having unhealthy influence, undue influence, being coercive, controlling. Have you seen storytelling be used in an unhealthy way?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess yes, because I've helped a couple politicians craft stories and then sort of regretted helping them because I saw how those stories were going to be deployed, you know. So yeah, I guess, I mean, I think we've seen it in real life, actually. We can envision excellent speakers who weave beautiful stories and do terrible things. I think that's a reality of the world. So yeah, I think that possibility exists. I don't think it exists as very often, and I think it's a lot harder to do. I think it's probably pretty hard to, I think you have to be really despicable to sort of be a vulnerable, authentic person in the purpose of being nefarious at the same time. Those things tend not to go well together, but I think certain people manage to really pull that off extraordinarily well. My experience has been, whenever I share stories with people, they get closer to me. The secret of my teaching career really is that I tell my students stories all day. I'm not the best deliverer of lessons. I don't design the best lessons. My colleagues around me are supremely expert compared to me at all of the things that make you a good teacher. The thing that I do is I tell them stories about myself, vulnerable, authentic, meaningful stories. And then my students end up willing to run through walls for me because they know me so well. They feel me so well, all of those things. And that's happened for me in all aspects of life. Someone once asked my wife, why did you fall in love with Matt? And I was there when they asked, which was great. I figured she would say, take one look at him. I mean, how could you not? And she told me, no, it's never been that. She said that it was through his stories. She said, we went to dinner one night as teachers, fellow teachers working in the same building, waiting for a talent show to begin. We went to dinner and she asked me questions and I told her stories. You ask me a question, I always answer with a story. And she said, he told stories that most people don't tell. And he told them in wonderful ways. And she said, I realized I was never going to be bored with this man, that there was always going to be something interesting that he was going to say. So I got the best spouse in the world through storytelling. And every time I tell a story, I get closer to people. So it can be used probably nefariously, but probably not very often.
And any tips on how to know if your stories are going too long or they're boring or,
Yeah, well, the thing I tell people is when I work on a story, when I'm getting ready to tell a story, I always assume that no one wants to hear anything I have to say. And that is a wonderful assumption to lead with because it forces you to be entertaining at all times. The trick or the problem really of the world is that we tell 99.9% of our stories to people who love us or people who work for us. And therefore, we receive positive feedback on our storytelling at all times, even when it's bad, because people love us or they fear us, right? So the only way you can know if you're really good is you do what I do, which is you stand in front of 500 strangers and you find out how they feel about you by their reaction. And in some cases, their scores that they give you in the competitions I do. So if you just go into every storytelling opportunity with the assumption that no one wants to hear you and no one cares about you in any way, then you're automatically going to seek ways to be engaging. And that is through, making them wonder what's going to happen next or building suspense and surprise or using humor, all of these strategies that I can teach people. But I think what most people do is they just assume everyone wants to hear them or that, sure, I'll give you 10 minutes of my life for your boring story, right? Which your spouse will do, and maybe your child will do, and maybe your cubicle mate will do because they have to sit with you every day. But that doesn't mean you're going to tell a good story. So assume that no one wants to hear from you, and that will automatically raise your game. It'll automatically make every story shorter too, because the shorter story always wins. The shortest version of every story always wins. If I told you, let's go to the movies right now, we can go see a movie that's 6 hours long or a movie that's 2 hours long. Both are equally excellent. It would make sense to want to go to the 6-hour movie because it's a better value, like same price, more entertainment. Even if you had the whole day ahead of you with no plans, the 2-hour movie just sounds better. And if we take that approach to every time we speak and we think to ourselves, what's the quickest way to tell this thing? We're always going to be a better storyteller as a result.
I like that. Any particular life lesson or aspect of your book, Someday is Today, that you really would like to drive home with this particular audience?
I guess the thing I would like people to think about is the way we make decisions is often predicated upon how we feel right now. So if I was to make a decision on how to spend my time right now, I'd be playing golf and eating a cheeseburger. That's 100% what I would be doing right now if I had a choice. I think we're very unreliable in the moment. And so this practice that I've sort of developed is something I call the 100-year-old plan, which is the idea that if I have to make a decision about how to spend the next hour, day, week, month, whatever it's going to be, I don't rely on the wisdom of me in the moment because I'm not that wise. What I do is I look ahead to the 100-year-old version of myself, the one presumably lying on his deathbed, right? Really, I'm looking to the 21-year-old who was on a floor in a restaurant with a gun to his head, but I'm not going to ask you to do that. Instead, imagine yourself being 100 and ask that person at the end of your life, how he or she wants you to spend this next hour. Because when you ask the 100-year-old version of yourself, what should I do for the next couple hours? They never say binge Netflix. They never say doom scroll through Twitter, right? They never say putter around the apartment and kind of do nothing, but, pick up a few things and make yourself feel busy. They never say, go to bed early. You're not really tired, but I mean, why not? Right? Those are things they never say. They say, well, you got 2 hours. I don't have 2 hours at the end of my life. Do something. Well, go pet your cat, because cats don't live that long and you love that cat ridiculously. So go pet the cat. Or go to the driving range, because your 7-iron is really not that straight right now, and it's going to ruin the next 10 years of your golfing. Or go play with your son, because he just walked in and he wants to play with you. Or go work on your business, because that's going to pay off a lot more than doom scrolling or Netflix. So when we start looking ahead at the future version of ourselves and we ask that version of ourselves how to make decisions in the present, we make better decisions, better long-term decisions, which yield greater happiness. So don't wake up and think about what you're going to do in the moment. Imagine in the future what your future self would want you to be doing now. And that's the best way to make decisions.
Okay. 2 more questions for you. Where can people find you, your books?
They can find me at matthewdix.com. They can find my books wherever you get books. I recommend indie bookstores. And if they don't have my book, you can ask them to order, because those are the biggest lovers of books in the world, and we should reward them in every way. If they're interested in Homework for Life or my 100-year-old plan, I have TED Talks on both of those, so they can sort of get a lot more details. If they just Google my name and TED Talk, those will pop up for them. But basically, you can find everything at matthewdix.com.
And we'll put links to your TED Talks and your website and whatnot in the show notes for sure. Okay, last question for you. So for somebody who wants to have a voice of influence, what last piece of advice would you want to give to them today?
That's a good question. Well, I guess if you want to have a voice of influence, I think the first thing you have to do in life, and I guess I've already said this to one degree or another, is to be a listener. Now, I said be the last person to speak when you come into a room, but the other thing I really think is important is to do basically what we have done today, which is you've afforded me the opportunity to speak by prompting me and asking me essentially to tell you stories about me and my book. I think that the people that work with us, the people that work for us, so often they desperately want to be known to the person who is leading them. And I think when you're in a position of leadership, you sometimes don't understand the barrier that exists between you and the person who's working for you. You don't feel like there's a barrier because your words flow down easily. But to push your words up to a leader, to tell a leader something they need to hear, or just to feel known, so that when you go to work, you know that your boss knows something meaningful about your life beyond the walls of the office, that often requires a leader to say, how was your weekend? How did you spend your weekend? Knowing the names of the children of the people who work for you, understanding that, Joe goes to the farmer's market on Sunday and Sandy plays in a softball league. Those are the kinds of things that I think a lot of times leaders discount as not important. And I think the people who work for you find incredibly important, because ultimately we want to be seen and known. So part of that listening is, again, be the last person to speak in every room you enter, but also be the kind of person who asks those questions and opens up a space where the people who work for you feel like they can speak. Because pushing words up is really hard unless someone says, I want to know the answer to this question about you or your children or your parents or your passions. So go to those people and talk to them and ask them to tell you about them. I think it's a really good way to get people to feel good about you and what they're doing for a living.
Thank you so much for this insightful and inspiring conversation, Matthew Dix. Appreciate you being here.
I appreciate you having me here. Thank you so much.